Now, Professor Noakes, in your presentation, in your evidence previously, there was a lot made about ketones and not spoken about that. Is there anything you want to add with regard to the issue of ketones?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ramdas. There was a lovely paper published also in the last 2 months from Cambridge and Oxford. And this is a result of collaborations with researchers in the United States who have been able to produce an orally ingested ketone body. And this has taken years for them to develop. And if you take this orally ingested ketone body, your blood ketone concentrations, which recall from the previous discussions, is probably about 0.1 or 0.2 if you're on a high carbohydrate diet, can go from 0.2 to 7 within half an hour. So this is astonishing. So now we can suddenly increase the ketone bodies in the bloodstream from 0.2 to 7 in 30 minutes, and we don't have to carbohydrate deplete the person, because that's the only other way you know that we can raise ketone bodies is to put people on a low carbohydrate diet. So now what people can do, can study humans who have not depleted their carbohydrate stores. They've got lots of carbohydrate, and they give them ketones, and then they study them. And this group, please understand, from Cambridge and Oxford, leading universities in the world, published a significant paper, which we'll come to. And these are the two authors, and I'm not going to show this, but this gives some of the background, and I'm not going to go through that slide. I'm going to go forward 2 slides. So I'm just going to lead you through their research, and then we'll come to the significant paper at the end. So this is a paper, one of their first abstracts, published in 2015 and presented at this Congress, and it's the effects of exercise intensity on circulating blood ketone body clearance. So now what they do is they measure blood ketone bodies after you've taken the ketone and then during exercise. And the clear evidence is if the ketones disappear quickly, they're being burned somewhere. They're being used as a fuel, and that's exactly what they found. So they showed that these data demonstrate an exponential increase in blood ketone body clearance. That means the harder you exercise, the quicker you depleted the blood of ketones. So in other words, these ketones are being used as a fuel during exercise. And they said that suggests the hierarchy of muscular fuel selection was altered during incremental exercise in the presence of ketosis. Why do they say that? Because when you're doing more intense exercise, you're meant to be burning more carbohydrate. And what they're showing actually, that you also burn a lot of ketone bodies. But we could never detect that in the past because the blood ketone levels were so low that you couldn't have detected the extent to which they were being used. And then they found the next point, and the point of this is that ketones act in ways we don't yet understand. And here they show that if you take ketones after exercise, you stimulate glucose storage in the muscles. And that's in a way that you can't do just by taking carbohydrate. So again, ketones have an effect on the metabolism that was unanticipated. So in the presence of high elevated ketones, glucose uptake is increased, and that causes higher muscle glycogen deposition. And that is beyond the levels achieved by the gold standard high-dose intravenous glucose infusions. Normally we infuse glucose, we store muscle glycogen very quickly. They found they could even do better just by giving ketones. So this is a novel finding, and it also increases insulin in the bloodstream. So something's happening with ketones that was completely unanticipated. Now the next thing they found was that when you use ketones, the amount of fat that you use from inside the muscle, now we're talking about fat that sits in the muscle, not the fat that's coming in the bloodstream. Ketosis increased the rate at which the muscle burns its own fat stores. So it makes you a fat-burning animal if you take ketones, even if you've got a high carbohydrate diet. And so their conclusion was that nutritional ketosis is able to harness the innate metabolic responses to starvation, increasing intramuscular triglyceride, or that's the form of fat, oxidation 20-fold during exercise in the presence of normal muscle glycogen, i.e. normal carbohydrate stores. And then these findings may have important implications not just for endurance exercise, but for conditions of dysregulated fatty acid oxidation, such as insulin resistance. So once more, the evidence that ketones are having an effect that no one could have anticipated until this research was done. And then their final paper, which is a conglomerate of all these studies, which was published in Cell Metabolism, also in the last 2 months or so, and there to emphasize where it comes from. It's for Oxford, Cambridge, London, Cambridge, and then the United States. So this is a high-quality group of researchers producing absolutely novel research on something no one had ever thought would be possible. And I mention this because the argument for the complainant was that ketones are toxic to the body, they're dangerous, and you've got to keep values low. Now they take athletes, they make them exercise vigorously, and they drive their ketone body levels high to 4, 5, 6, 7, which is way higher than we can achieve normally. And what do they find? If the complainant is correct, these people must suffer negative consequences. And so what do they find? In 5 separate studies of 39 performance athletes, we showed how this unique metabolic state improves physical endurance by altering fuel competition for oxidative respiration, and the rest is unimportant. How it does it, we've kind of been through that. But the point is, physical endurance was improved. And so you cannot say that ketones are toxic to the body. They produce effects that we don't yet fully understand. And this is a whole area of new research that's going to take off in the next few years. And so these findings may hold clues to greater human potential and a better understanding of fuel metabolism in health and disease. So that's the way that this is going to go, is that these ketones are going to be used and studied in disease, not just in healthy athletes. And I was asked to put this one in, and it's because we're at the end spurt, you'll see why. So Usain Bolt won 3 gold medals at the Olympics, and we're glad to report that he also eats a low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet. And maybe it's all those ketones that are driving him to his success. And the story is the Banting diet that the SWIP South African communities is set for another boost that emerged that Usain Bolt adheres to the key themes in eating high protein, low carbs. I'm not going to go any further, but that's just a nice, interesting little story because it suggests that we really don't understand everything about nutrition for elite athletes. And then more, even closer to home, Chris Froome, maybe not everyone knows that he's got very strong South African ties. He graduated from St. John's College in Johannesburg. He studied at the University of Johannesburg. And all that time he was doing what he should do. He was eating a high carbohydrate diet, and he couldn't cycle to win the Tour de France. And all of a sudden he discovered the low carbohydrate diet, and he won 3 Tour de France titles. And this is the story of that. And it's not all that important, but it comes to Cape Town that his girlfriend, now his wife, is a Capetonian, and he came to her and he said he'd starved himself to lose weight, and he'd come second in the Tour of Spain because he'd lost 20 pounds before the race. And she said to him, Chris, you can't starve yourself like that. You've got to eat a decent diet. And she said, you must eat a high-protein diet, which of course doesn't exist. There's no such thing as a high-protein diet. So what she must have put him on was a high-fat diet. So he got rid of the carbohydrates in his diet, as well as the breakfast cereals and the foods containing wheat, and he introduced more fatty proteins such as salmon and eggs. Instead of starving himself, Froome ate smaller meals more often, whereas now my diet is a lot more protein-based. I've cut back on carbohydrates, but I'm not losing muscle. And I'm fairly certain that the team he cycles for also uses ketone bodies both before and during races. And this gives us this rather interesting slide. Now, this is Chris Froome when he was in South Africa as a professional cyclist, being told to eat a high carbohydrate diet, and he weighed 75 kilograms, despite the fact that he's cycling 6 hours a day. He goes on the low carbohydrate diet, and he looks entirely different, and people will say he looks skeletal and he looks unhealthy. Well, he's probably the most best endurance athlete in the world at the moment. And he's now on 60, weighs 67 kilograms, and that difference in 8 kilograms is the difference between being an average but talented professional cyclist and winning the Tour de France 3 times. And the reason why I show this slide is an anecdote, but it shows you cannot outcycle the effects of a bad diet. That's terrible. Even professional Tour de France cyclists cannot out-exercise the effects of a bad diet. And he admits that he has a sugar addiction, or not a sugar addiction, that he has a sweet tooth. His wife says he has a sweet tooth, and he's got to stay away from the sweet foods. Because when he's eating sweet foods, he looks as he does on your left, but when he's not eating carbohydrates, that's what he looks like on the right. And he's a multi-millionaire now as a result of eating a low-carbohydrate diet. I'd just like to finish up now on a video clip which I did present, which I did discover. And before we get there, this is the first article. And this is a point I made at great length in the presentation, but I thought I should include this paper because it comes from Nature, and Nature is considered the top journal in the world. And there's the title, Clever Eating, Consumption of Animals Helped Hominins to Grow Bigger Brains. But in a world rich with fruit, how necessary is meat? And so there you see the hominins killing an animal, and the argument is that it was eating the meat, and particularly the fat, from fish that made us grow bigger brains. And so this is what is written in Nature. On the 3rd of March 2016, in the 1980s, researchers began to suspect, and this is relevant to South Africa, that a lack of meat in some poor rural villages was contributing to a spectrum of childhood problems, including short stature, weakened immunity, social difficulties, and poor school performance. When researchers from 5 universities studied the effects of chronic malnutrition in Mexico, Kenya, and Egypt, they found that children who consumed the greatest amount of meat and dairy products scored highest on physical, cognitive, and behavioral tests, particularly in Kenya. But was the absence of meat really to blame? What the researchers needed was a controlled study. And that was some of the evidence that I presented previously. And then in their controlled trials, and I think these are referring mainly to the studies of Dr. Krebs, which we presented, compared with the other group, students in the meat group had greater muscle mass and fewer health problems, and even showed greater leadership in the playground. Cognitive performance was stronger too. The meat group outperformed other groups in maths and language subjects. Newman was not surprised by the results. The typical diet in rural Kenya is subsistence-based and does not include many nutrients that help the brain to grow. And that was part of the argument I presented at great length in February. So the challenge now is to get people to consume more meat, which is widely regarded as too expensive. What people don't realize, Newman said, is that to nourish the brain, pretty much any animal matter will do. And that's key. Any animal matter, not vegetable matter, animal matter. Meat can be a worm, caterpillar, or termite. It doesn't have to be a butchered meat. So there is Nature on the 3rd of March 2016 confirming what we provided to you. And then this is just the opposite, that this is a paper, I think it was the Telegraph, showing that if you raise your babies on a vegan diet, that is now illegal in Italian law. And of course it has to be illegal because a vegan diet does not have the nutrients to allow the child's brain to develop. Parents who force a vegan diet onto their children would face prison under a new law proposed in Italy. Parents who provide children aged 16 and under with a diet lacking essential elements for a healthy growth, and those essential elements come from meat and fish and dairy and eggs, could face up to 2 years of prison, etc., etc., etc. And she notes that the vegan diet leaves children potentially lacking iron, zinc, and B12, which can lead to neurological problems. And the reason is B12 is only found in meat products, and iron and zinc are found in usable quantities in meat. They are present in cereals and grains, but not in the same concentration, and they're not as well absorbed. So that was just to confirm that you have to have meat-based foods if you're going to be a healthy child.